Now, the theme for 2024 seems to be all about who's in charge. From South Africa to Algeria, a third of the continent's nations will choose new governments this year. They include coup-hit Mali, Chad and Burkina Faso if their military leaders keep their word. There are 18 elections scheduled in this continent this year alone. Political analyst Siyatuma Piniza joins us now to unpack Africa's expectations during this election year. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Piniza, here on ENCA. How is this likely to affect especially some of our free trade agreements, for instance?
Sure. I think to a large extent there will be a lot of continuity, largely because, at least from South African and Southern African perspective, a lot of the governments and democracies are relatively stable. However, this will reopen a lot of opportunities that had initially or historically been closed down over the last 2 years, particularly considering the West African and Sahel countries, specifically Mali, Burkina Faso and Chad, whom over the last 2 years had unconstitutional changes in power. And so those are countries that are currently under transitional authorities. And obviously, if they hold peaceful and fair elections, then the expectations is that all the restrictions that were put against these countries will now be lifted, and the international community will re-engage a lot of these countries. And this also applies to some East African countries, including South Sudan. And so a large part in the rest of the continent does hold on these countries holding free and fair elections in order for them to be re-engaged in the international community and for trade and normal economic relations to resume.
And, what about the fact that we saw that in December, for instance, the JSE, gaining about 12% since November? It looks like market appetite for risk is growing, particularly in this part of the continent, at least. Will that also play a factor?
I think generally, yes. And I think the driver for this is twofold. As I mentioned, a lot of the countries that had unconstitutional changes in power over the last 2 years are now resuming democratic or civilian rule. And then that is seen as a positive light on the African continent in terms of political risk. The second driver is the fact that in the international geopolitical realm, there's a lot of uncertainty driven by issues such as the continuing Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the Israeli-Gaza conflict, which is now obviously expected to worsen and may involve regional members, particularly in the Middle Eastern conflict, as mentioned. And so apart from the risk appetite being, I think, more open towards Africa, what is actually positive is that African political risk, if these countries are able to hold free and fair elections and have democratically elected people resume control of the country and resume power, this is a positive step in terms of reducing political risk on the continent.
And of course, we do have our own issues in the continent. For instance, there isn't stability everywhere in the continent. In fact, there's a lot of areas where there is no stability, including even your Mozambique and your Burkina Faso, etc. But if you look at the fact that our economy as a continent is also looking like it's stabilizing, will that also continue to bring us more investment, no matter who takes charge after elections?
Well, there is a slight part to that. I think that there's some truth to that, given that, the traditional markets are still volatile. For instance, the European and American markets are still being battered by high inflation. The European market, particularly given the volatility caused by the Russia-Ukraine conflict, is still seen as a challenge. However, these markets still and will remain the traditional investment markets. But the prospects that African countries do provide is high levels of growth. And this is true of all emerging markets. And if you add the positive step in terms of the improving political risk climate on the continent, this then reduces a lot of the risk premium that investors associate with the continent, which means that returns for investors are expected to increase. So I think in this current climate of global geopolitical uncertainty and improving political risk on the continent, Africa as general, and particularly countries that are now resuming civilian rule, are expected to be attractive investment destinations and will most likely present very high returns for investors, given that the emerging markets generally and Africa in particular is a high growth environment. And the only setback for the past 3 years has been obviously the slow recovery from the COVID pandemic. And more recently, the issues around unconstitutional changes in West Africa and the CFA or former French colony in particular across the continent. And this is the first wave of resumption of civilian rule, which means that, investors are looking very closely at these countries and how they will hold their elections this year.
What about ratings agencies? Global ratings agencies, for instance, in South Africa, they've steadily downgraded our economy in this country. That has affected even our performance. And we are still considered, one of the strongest economy in this continent. So those will still remain a thorn on our side, right? As long as because most of the time their reasoning is about political interference and political stability.
Yes. Look, I think on the continent, although we're having a positive improvement in terms of political risk, we're still facing a number of economic challenges. A lot of African countries obviously still depend on commodity exports. Currently, commodity prices have been depressed, and that's largely due to some slowdown in Chinese demand for commodities, but also a recovery in the global economy following the sanctions that were set against Russia in the onset of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. What this has meant for African governments is that the fiscal situation has not improved. And given that commodity prices have been low, the economic recovery from the global impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine conflict, the recovery from that has been slow. What has meant that governments continue to spend in order to try and support economic growth. But in the context of slow economic environment, governments have actually seen a rise in public debt. And this has actually pushed a number of African governments into public debt distress and with some outright defaults. And in particular here, I'm talking about countries like Zambia, Ethiopia, Chad, as well as Ghana. And of these four that I've mentioned, 3 are expected to hold elections this year. So I think on the rating agency side, whilst this the political elections or the free and fair elections we expect this year are a positive light, there is still the downside risk caused by slow economic growth, low commodity prices that significantly affects government finances. And as a result, governments are still struggling with a smooth recovery from these global impacts, as mentioned, in terms of the COVID pandemic, as well as the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, the bigger risk is still something that's unpriced with regards to the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Yeah. And if that conflict becomes regional, one would expect that commodities, particularly crude oil, which is a global commodity, will have a knock. And so countries will fall on the positive or negative side of that, depending on what they export and obviously their dependence on petroleum imports.
And of course, not forgetting South Africa's decision to flex their diplomatic muscle during the course of this festive season and taking Israel to the ICC with charges of genocide. So it's going to be a very interesting year, especially in the African continent, and some of the countries in this continent trying to show a little bit of their power and independence. Duma Piniza chatting to us. He's a political economist. About 18 African countries taking to the polls, including us this year. What will that mean for our continent economically? Well, let's take you to your weather now. I'll be back with you at the top of lunchtime.
There is still the downside risk caused by slow economic growth, low commodity prices that significantly affects government finances. And as a result, governments are still struggling with a smooth recovery from these global impacts, as mentioned, in terms of the COVID pandemic, as well as the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, the bigger risk is still something that's unpriced with regards to the Israeli-Gaza conflict. Yeah. And if that conflict becomes regional, one would expect that commodities, particularly crude oil, which is a global commodity, will have a knock. And so countries will fall on the positive or negative side of that, depending on what they export and obviously their dependence on petroleum imports.
And of course, not forgetting South Africa's decision to flex their diplomatic muscle during the course of this festive season and taking Israel to the ICC with charges of genocide. So it's going to be a very interesting year, especially in the African continent, and some of the countries in this continent trying to show a little bit of their power and independence. Duma Piniza chatting to us. He's a political economist about 18 African countries taking to the polls, including us this year. What will that mean for our continent economically? Well, let's take you to your weather now. I'll be back with you at the top of lunchtime.